Sometimes the most powerful stories don't begin with success. They begin with a moment so shocking that it changes the way someone sees the world forever. Imagine lying in a hospital room where every second feels uncertain. Machines quietly measure the rhythm of life, doctors move with calm urgency, and somewhere outside that room decisions are being made that could determine whether tomorrow even exists. In moments like that, most people believe one thing without question: that family will fight for them, that someone will stand between them, and the worst possible outcome. But what happens when that belief shatters? What happens when a single decision, written in ink on a simple piece of paper, reveals that money, convenience, or fear mattered more than a human life? What happens when the people you trusted the most quietly choose a path that no one expects them to take? This story is about that moment. A moment of betrayal that unfolded inside the silent walls of a hospital. A moment when the value of a life was weighed against a price tag, and a moment that seemed at first like the end of everything. But sometimes the darkest decisions create the most powerful turning points, because what no one expected was what happened next. Within just 72 hours, the truth began to surface. Secrets that had been hidden for years slowly started coming into the light. The same decision that was meant to protect money and control the situation quietly set off a chain of consequences no one could stop, and in the middle of it all, the person who was supposed to be powerless discovered something stronger than anger, stronger than revenge: the power of truth and resilience. This isn't just a story about betrayal, it's a story about survival, about justice that arrives in unexpected ways, and about how the choices people make in their darkest moments can eventually destroy the very things they tried to protect. So stay with this story until the very end, because what unfolds over the next 72 hours will reveal a truth that no one saw coming. The decision was made in a place that should have been filled with care, hope, and the quiet determination to save a life. Instead, the air felt heavy with something colder: calculation. Hospital rooms have a way of making everything feel fragile. The soft beeping of monitors, the steady rhythm of machines, the muted footsteps of nurses walking through the halls. In those moments, every person expects one thing from the people who call themselves family: protection. Not perfection, not miracles. Just the simple promise that when life hangs by a thread, someone will fight for it. But sometimes, the truth arrives in a way no one expects, not with shouting or dramatic confessions, but with a single piece of paper, a form, a signature, words printed in clinical language that sound harmless until their meaning sinks in. Do not resuscitate. 3 words that quietly decide whether doctors will fight for a heartbeat if it suddenly stops. At first, it didn't make sense. Hospitals are full of complicated decisions, and sometimes those decisions are made to ease suffering. That is what people are told to believe. But there was something about the way the situation unfolded that felt wrong. Too fast. Too quiet. The kind of silence that follows a choice already made behind closed doors. Money has a strange way of revealing what people truly value. In ordinary conversations, it hides behind polite smiles and careful words. But in moments of crisis, when a life depends on action, priorities become painfully clear. A number on a bill. The cost of another day of treatment. The expense of machines that keep someone breathing. Suddenly the conversation shifts, and what should have been about survival begins to revolve around dollars. Imagine lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by strangers in white coats, while somewhere outside that room a decision is made, not about hope, but about cost. Not about love, but about convenience. The realization hits slowly, like cold water seeping through cracks in a wall. At first there is confusion, then disbelief. Then something far heavier: the understanding that someone who was supposed to protect life had quietly chosen the cheaper option instead. It wasn't just a medical decision, it was a message, a silent declaration about worth, and once that truth is seen, once the meaning behind that signature becomes impossible to ignore, nothing in the world looks the same anymore. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, like a shadow stretching across the floor of a quiet hospital room. At first there was confusion, the kind that makes a person question whether they misunderstood something. Medical terms are complicated, paperwork is overwhelming, and hospitals are places where decisions often feel rushed. It seemed possible that there had been some mistake, some misunderstanding buried inside all the clinical language and urgent conversations. But the more the truth settled in, the clearer it became that this wasn't confusion at all. It was something far deeper and far more painful. Growing up, there is an unspoken belief that the people who raise you will always choose your life over everything else. Children carry that belief quietly, like a shield that protects them from the darker parts of the world. No matter how difficult things become, that shield remains. It's built from years of trust, from the simple idea that family means safety. But when that belief cracks, the sound it makes inside a person is deafening. The emotional pain didn't come from the hospital machines or the sterile smell of antiseptic. It came from the understanding that somewhere outside that room, a calculation had been made. A decision that weighed life against something else and decided the cost was too high. That realization cuts deeper than any physical wound because it forces someone to confront a question they never imagined asking: was survival considered too expensive? In that moment, the heart begins to carry a weight that words struggle to describe. It's not just anger. Anger can be loud and explosive. This feeling was quieter but far heavier. It was betrayal. The kind that settles deep in the chest and refuses to leave. The kind that makes every childhood memory feel suddenly uncertain. Moments that once felt warm begin to look different under the light of this new truth. There is also a strange loneliness that comes with that discovery. Hospitals are full of people, nurses, doctors, patients, visitors, but none of them can fill the space created when trust collapses. A person can be surrounded by activity and still feel completely alone because the one place that was supposed to offer unconditional support suddenly feels like the source of the deepest wound. And in the middle of that emotional storm, something begins to change inside. Pain has a way of transforming people. What starts as heartbreak slowly turns into clarity, and clarity has a way of revealing truths that were hidden for years. Hospitals often carry a strange kind of silence, the kind that doesn't come from emptiness but from too many emotions pressing against the walls at once. Inside that room, the lights were bright but somehow everything still felt dim, as if the world outside had been muted. Machines hummed softly, monitors blinked in steady patterns, and every few seconds the faint beep of a heart monitor reminded everyone that time was moving forward, whether anyone was ready for it or not. The bed sat in the center of the room like the quiet stage of an unfolding drama. Thin curtains hung near the windows, barely moving in the controlled air of the hospital ventilation. The smell of antiseptic lingered everywhere, sharp and clean, trying to mask the heavier feeling that filled the space. Nurses moved in and out with practiced calm, checking charts, adjusting tubes, offering brief reassuring smiles before disappearing down the hallway again. But beneath that calm routine, the atmosphere felt different. There was a tension that couldn't quite be explained, something invisible but impossible to ignore. Conversations between staff members were quieter than usual, voices lowered as if the walls themselves might hear what was being said. When they glanced at the chart clipped near the bed, their expressions shifted slightly, professional but careful. In moments like that, time seems to stretch. Minutes feel longer than they should. Every sound becomes amplified. The slow rolling of a medical cart in the hallway, the distant echo of a door closing, the rustle of papers as someone reviews a file. Even the smallest details begin to matter. A nurse pausing for an extra second while reading a document. A doctor exhaling softly before placing the clipboard back down. There is something unsettling about being surrounded by people who know more about your situation than you do. Their calm voices and practiced expressions hide layers of information, decisions, and conversations that happen somewhere else. Behind every form and every line of text is a choice that shapes what will happen next. The hospital room itself almost becomes a witness. The pale walls, the dim shadows under the medical equipment, the quiet glow of the monitor screens, they hold the weight of what has already been decided. In a place where lives are fought for every day, the realization that a decision about survival has already been written down somewhere changes the entire atmosphere. The room no longer feels like a place of hope. It feels like a place where something vital has already been quietly taken away. Betrayal doesn't always arrive with raised voices or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it appears quietly, hidden inside a realization that slowly reshapes everything a person once believed about the people closest to them. In moments of vulnerability, especially in a hospital where life feels fragile, there is an instinctive expectation that family will stand as a shield against the worst possibilities. The idea of protection becomes almost sacred. When the world feels uncertain, that belief is supposed to remain unbreakable. But when that expectation collapses, the silence that follows feels heavier than any argument. It begins with a small moment of doubt. A question forms quietly in the back of the mind. Why did this happen the way it did? Why was this decision made so quickly? Without hesitation, without the desperate fight that most people would expect when a life is involved. At first, the thought feels impossible to accept, because it challenges years of trust that were built slowly over time. The sense of betrayal grows as the truth becomes clearer. Every memory starts to shift under the weight of that understanding. Childhood moments that once seemed ordinary suddenly carry a different meaning. Words that once sounded protective now feel distant. The person who was supposed to stand firmly between danger and harm suddenly appears on the other side of the line, making choices that place convenience or personal interest ahead of someone else's survival. What makes the feeling even more painful is the quietness of it all. There are no dramatic scenes, no loud accusations echoing through the hospital hallway. Instead, the betrayal sits quietly in the heart like an invisible weight. It shows itself in the way the room feels colder, in the way conversations feel strained, in the way trust disappears without making a sound. Expectations play a powerful role in shaping that pain. No one grows up believing they will one day question whether their own life was considered worth protecting. That belief is so deeply rooted that when it breaks, it leaves behind a deep emotional fracture. It's not just about the decision itself, it's about what that decision represents. A moment where loyalty was expected but calculation took its place. And once that realization settles in, something fundamental changes inside. The bond that once felt unquestionable begins to feel fragile, as if it had always been built on something weaker than it appeared. The understanding that protection was never guaranteed becomes impossible to ignore, and the silence surrounding that truth grows louder with every passing moment. Sometimes the most life-altering moments don't arrive with noise or chaos. They arrive quietly, almost unnoticed, carried by something as ordinary as a sheet of paper. Hospitals are full of documents, forms for medication, insurance approvals, consent papers, and medical histories. Most of them feel routine, just another part of the system that keeps everything moving. But every once in a while, a single document carries a weight far heavier than the others, because what it represents reaches far beyond ink and signatures. On the surface, it looked like just another medical form placed among many others. The words printed across it were formal and clinical, written in a language designed to sound calm and professional. Yet behind those words was a decision that could shape the boundary between life and death. A "do not resuscitate" order isn't loud or dramatic. It doesn't make alarms ring or machines stop instantly. Instead, it sits quietly in a patient's file, waiting for a moment when it might suddenly become the most important instruction in the room. The strange thing about such a document is how simple it appears. Just a few paragraphs explaining that if the heart stops or breathing fails, medical staff will not attempt to bring the patient back. No chest compressions, no electric shocks, no emergency interventions meant to restart a fading life. It transforms the role of doctors and nurses from fighters, trying to reverse the impossible, into silent witnesses who must follow what has already been written. What makes the moment even more powerful is the realization that everything came down to a single signature. One name written at the bottom of the page. One quick movement of a pen. In that instant, something invisible but enormous shifts. The future, which once held the possibility of desperate attempts to save a life, suddenly narrows into a quieter path where those attempts will never happen. A signature seems so small compared to the weight it carries. It takes only a second to write, yet it can echo through hours, days, or even years afterward. The person holding the pen might see it as just another step in a complicated situation, another choice among many. But for the one whose life is tied to that decision, the meaning is far more profound. That single line of ink doesn't just complete a form, it creates a turning point, a moment where the direction of everything that follows changes instantly and permanently. The realization didn't happen in a single moment. It unfolded slowly, like a curtain being pulled back inch by inch. At first, there was still a fragile hope clinging to the belief that family loyalty was something permanent, something that couldn't be shaken even in the most difficult circumstances. People grow up with that belief so deeply planted inside them that it feels almost impossible to imagine a world where it isn't true. Loyalty is supposed to be automatic, a quiet promise that when everything else falls apart, family will remain the one thing that doesn't. But sometimes, reality moves differently than expectations. It begins with small details that seem insignificant at first. A conversation that ends too quickly, a decision that feels rushed, a look exchanged between people who seem to understand something that hasn't yet been explained. Those details linger in the mind long after the moment has passed, slowly connecting with one another until they form a pattern that can no longer be ignored. The hospital room becomes a place where those thoughts echo. Machines continue their steady rhythm, doctors move through their routines, and nurses carry on with the calm professionalism they've practiced for years. Yet inside, something begins to shift. The sense of security that once existed begins to fade, replaced by a growing awareness that the loyalty once assumed might not have been as strong as it seemed. Memories start to resurface during that quiet time. Childhood moments, conversations from years ago, little incidents that once felt unimportant. When those memories are viewed through the lens of the present, they begin to look different. Certain words now carry a sharper edge. Certain choices begin to reveal patterns that were invisible before. It becomes clear that loyalty is not always unconditional, and sometimes it bends under the weight of convenience, fear, or personal interest. The most painful part of that realization isn't anger. Anger can flare up and burn out quickly. What lingers longer is the understanding that the bond once trusted without question might have always had limits that were hidden until the moment they truly mattered. That awareness settles quietly into the heart, heavy and undeniable. In that space between disbelief and acceptance, the mind struggles to reconcile two realities: the image of family that existed for years and the truth that now stands in front of it. The gap between those two realities becomes impossible to ignore, and the weight of that understanding grows heavier with every passing hour. Hospitals have a way of turning ordinary conversations into moments that feel far more significant than they would anywhere else. Voices are usually calm and professional, shaped by years of training that teaches medical staff how to deliver information carefully. Yet when someone is lying in a hospital bed, every word spoken nearby begins to carry a deeper meaning. Even the quietest discussion can feel like it holds the power to change everything. At first, the voices in the room blended together with the usual sounds of the hospital environment. Nurses stepped in and out, checking monitors and recording numbers on charts. Doctors occasionally paused near the bed, glancing at documents before exchanging a few words with each other. None of it seemed unusual. Hospitals run on constant communication, small pieces of information passing between staff members to keep patients safe. But then certain words began to stand out. Phrases that didn't quite fit the comforting image people expect in a place meant to protect life. One nurse mentioned a document in a tone that sounded careful, almost hesitant. Another voice responded with quiet confirmation, referring to an instruction already placed in the patient's file. The conversation wasn't loud, yet the weight behind those words was impossible to ignore. Listening from the bed, there was a strange feeling of being present but somehow excluded from the full story. The staff spoke with the calm efficiency of professionals who had already accepted the reality written on the paperwork. To them, it was simply a guideline to follow, part of the many responsibilities they handled every day. But for the person hearing those words, the conversation carried a completely different meaning. The mention of a "do not resuscitate" order slipped into the discussion almost casually, as though it were just another line in a long list of medical instructions. A doctor quietly confirmed it while scanning the chart, and another staff member nodded before adjusting the equipment beside the bed. Their reactions weren't cruel or uncaring, they were simply following the protocol that the hospital required. Yet hearing those words spoken aloud felt like a door quietly closing somewhere in the distance. It was the moment when the reality behind the paperwork stopped being abstract and became something real. The decision that had once existed only as ink on a form was now shaping how the people in that room would act if the worst suddenly happened, and the knowledge of that truth settled heavily into the silence that followed. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from realizing that someone sees you not as a person, but as a problem to be managed. It doesn't arrive with harsh words or obvious insults. Instead, it reveals itself through decisions, through quiet choices that expose how someone truly measures your value. In moments of crisis, when compassion should naturally rise to the surface, those hidden measurements suddenly become impossible to ignore. Lying in a hospital room, surrounded by machines designed to support life, a person expects to feel vulnerable but protected. Vulnerability is unavoidable in a place like that. Bodies weaken, strength fades, and control over the simplest things slips away. But protection is supposed to come from the people who care the most. The belief that someone outside that room is fighting for your survival becomes a silent source of comfort. When that belief begins to break, the emotional impact is difficult to describe. It starts with a realization that the conversation about your condition may not revolve entirely around healing or recovery. Instead, other topics quietly enter the discussion. Bills, expenses, the cost of treatments, the price of another night in intensive care. Each of those numbers begins to appear as if they carry equal weight with a human life. At some point, the unsettling thought forms: what if the situation is being viewed not through the lens of love but through the lens of financial strain? The idea alone feels almost impossible to accept. Yet certain decisions begin to make more sense when seen from that perspective. A choice that seemed rushed now appears calculated. A form that looked routine now feels like evidence of something far colder. Being treated as a burden doesn't require anyone to say those words directly. It's something a person feels through the tone of conversations, through the speed of certain decisions, through the absence of hesitation when the stakes are life itself. The heart begins to sense that survival may have been weighed against the financial consequences it might create. That realization carries a deep emotional sting because it transforms the meaning of the entire situation. The hospital bed stops feeling like a place where someone is being protected and cared for. Instead, it begins to feel like a point on a balance sheet, where the cost of keeping someone alive may have been quietly judged as too high. At first, the mind struggles to understand what is really happening. Confusion settles in like a fog, making every thought feel distant and uncertain. When someone hears that a life or death decision has already been made, the natural reaction is disbelief. The brain instinctively looks for another explanation, something less painful, something that makes the situation easier to accept. Maybe the information was misunderstood. Maybe there was a mistake in the paperwork. Maybe someone meant something completely different than what it sounded like. That confusion lingers for a while, circling through the mind again and again. Every detail gets replayed: the quiet conversation between nurses, the careful tone of the doctor when mentioning the document, the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Each memory is examined from every possible angle, searching for proof that the reality forming in the background cannot possibly be true. But slowly, the fog begins to clear, and disbelief turns into something heavier. When the truth refuses to change no matter how many times it's questioned, a new emotion begins to rise. Anger. It starts quietly, almost like a spark buried under layers of shock. The realization that a decision about survival was made without hesitation begins to burn through the confusion. Questions that once sounded uncertain become sharper, louder inside the mind. Why would anyone make that choice? Why would a life be placed on the scale against something else and judged as less important? The anger grows stronger the more those questions remain unanswered. It isn't the explosive kind that leads to shouting or confrontation. Instead, it sits deep inside the chest, heavy and steady. It carries the weight of betrayal, mixed with the bitter understanding that something fundamental has been broken. Yet alongside that anger, another feeling begins to form. Disbelief slowly transforms into a painful clarity. The pieces of the situation start to connect, revealing a pattern that was invisible before. Decisions that once seemed random begin to look deliberate. Conversations that once felt ordinary now carry hidden meaning. In that emotional storm, the mind moves constantly between those feelings: confusion, anger, disbelief, each one rising and falling as the truth becomes harder to ignore. The heart tries to process what it means to discover that the people expected to protect life may have already decided not to fight for it. There comes a moment when confusion finally gives way to clarity. It doesn't happen with a dramatic announcement or a sudden revelation spoken out loud. Instead, it arrives quietly, like the slow turning on of a light in a dark room. At first, the shapes are blurry, uncertain, but as the light grows stronger, the outlines of everything become impossible to ignore. The same thing happens in the mind when a hidden truth finally begins to reveal itself. For a while, the situation had been surrounded by doubt. Every explanation seemed possible because the alternative felt too painful to accept. The mind naturally searches for reasons that soften the blow, reasons that make people's actions appear less cruel or less intentional. It's easier to believe in misunderstandings than to believe someone made a deliberate choice that placed money, convenience, or personal comfort above a life. But small details have a way of adding up. Each conversation overheard, each document glimpsed on a clipboard, each careful phrase spoken by hospital staff begins to form a pattern. What once seemed like separate events slowly connects into a single, undeniable picture. The rushed paperwork, the quiet confirmation from medical staff, the lack of hesitation in accepting the instruction written in the patient's file. That is the moment when clarity strikes. The mind stops searching for alternate explanations and finally accepts what those details have been pointing toward all along. The decision wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding, it was intentional. A calculated choice made somewhere outside the hospital room, written down with calm certainty, and delivered into the hands of doctors who were obligated to follow it. The realization settles heavily, not with explosive anger but with a deep and unsettling calm. It becomes clear that the conversation surrounding survival was never purely about health or medical complications. Something else had influenced it from the very beginning. The possibility that treatment might cost too much, that recovery might create financial strain, that prolonging a life might require sacrifices someone was unwilling to make. In that instant, the entire situation transforms. What once looked like a medical process now appears as a personal decision shaped by priorities that had nothing to do with compassion. The truth behind that decision stands clearly in front of the mind, leaving no room for denial and no way to return to the comfort of not knowing. There are moments in life that leave a mark so deep that they quietly reshape the person experiencing them. The realization of what had been done in that hospital room was one of those moments. At first it felt overwhelming, like standing in the middle of a storm with emotions crashing from every direction: confusion, anger, disbelief, grief. But as time passed and the truth settled more firmly in place, something else began to form beneath all that pain. It started as a quiet thought, barely noticeable at first. A realization that this moment could not simply fade into the past like an ordinary memory. Some experiences are too powerful to disappear. They become permanent markers in a person's life, reminders of a point where everything changed. The signature on that document, the calm voices of the medical staff confirming its existence, and the heavy understanding of why it had been signed, all fused together into a memory that refused to loosen its grip. In the silence of the hospital room, while machines continued their steady rhythm, that thought grew stronger. The mind replayed everything again and again, not searching for answers anymore but absorbing the reality of it, the sense of betrayal, the realization of being weighed against money, the quiet acceptance by everyone around that the decision had already been made. All of it carved itself into memory with a sharp clarity that time would never dull. Somewhere within that clarity, a promise began to take shape. Not a loud declaration spoken to the room, but a silent vow formed deep inside. The kind of promise a person makes only to themselves. A promise that this moment would never be forgotten. That the truth behind it would remain clear, no matter how much time passed or how many attempts were made to soften its meaning later. That vow carried a strange kind of strength with it. Pain has a way of doing that. It can break someone down, but it can also forge a deeper awareness of what truly matters. The quiet promise became a way of holding on to that awareness, a reminder that certain actions reveal the real character of the people involved. And in that still hospital room, surrounded by the quiet glow of machines and the steady passage of time, that promise settled firmly into place, becoming a silent witness to everything that had happened and everything that would follow afterward. At the beginning, everything felt fragile. The hospital room, the quiet machines, the uncertainty hanging in the air, it all created a sense of helplessness that was hard to escape. When someone realizes that a life-altering decision has been made without their voice being heard, the first emotion that settles in is vulnerability. It feels like standing on unsteady ground, unsure of what might happen next, unsure of who can truly be trusted. For a while, that vulnerability dominates every thought. The mind circles the same painful questions again and again, trying to make sense of something that feels deeply unfair. Why would someone make such a decision? Why was the value of a life placed next to numbers on a bill? Those questions echo endlessly, filling the silence of the hospital room and making every passing minute feel heavier. But something interesting happens when pain sits in the heart long enough. Slowly, almost quietly, the emotional weight begins to transform. The shock and disbelief that once paralyzed the mind begin to fade, replaced by something sharper and more focused. The vulnerability that once felt overwhelming starts to give way to awareness. The situation becomes clearer, not just emotionally but mentally. With that clarity comes a shift in perspective. Instead of feeling trapped inside the betrayal, the mind begins to step back and look at the bigger picture. The actions that led to this moment become easier to understand, not in a way that excuses them, but in a way that reveals the motivations behind them. Greed, fear, convenience, or self-interest can drive people to make choices that expose who they truly are. In that realization, a new feeling begins to rise: determination. It doesn't explode outward in dramatic gestures. Instead, it grows quietly, steady, and controlled. Determination to remember what has been revealed, determination to no longer ignore the truth about how certain people value others when money or comfort becomes involved. The emotional shift from vulnerability to determination is powerful because it changes how the entire situation is experienced. What once felt like a moment of weakness slowly becomes a turning point. Pain no longer controls every thought. Instead, it becomes a source of strength, sharpening awareness and building a quiet resolve that refuses to be ignored. Once the mind begins to see the truth behind a painful moment, it becomes impossible to stop noticing the details that were once ignored. The betrayal in the hospital room didn't exist in isolation. It was connected to something larger, something that had been quietly building beneath the surface for years. When a single event exposes a hidden reality, the past suddenly becomes filled with clues that had once seemed meaningless. Memories start returning with a new clarity. Conversations from long ago, moments that once felt ordinary, even small arguments that were quickly forgotten begin to carry a different weight. At the time they happened, none of them seemed significant enough to question. They were simply part of everyday life, pieces of family dynamics that people accept without much thought. But now those memories look different when viewed through the lens of what has just been revealed. Certain patterns begin to emerge. There were always discussions about money, about expenses, about the cost of things that others might consider normal parts of life. Sometimes those conversations carried a tone of frustration or control that didn't seem unusual back then, but now they begin to feel like early signs of a mindset where financial concerns could easily overshadow compassion. Even the way certain decisions were made in the past begins to look suspicious. Moments where generosity seemed limited, situations where help was offered reluctantly or only after careful calculation. Back then, it might have been explained as being practical or responsible. Now it feels like part of a much larger picture, one where priorities had always been quietly aligned with self-interest. The realization that secrets had been hiding in plain sight becomes unavoidable, not necessarily secrets in the sense of hidden documents or whispered conspiracies, but secrets in behavior. The true nature of someone's priorities often reveals itself slowly over time, disguised by everyday interactions and social expectations. People rarely show their full intentions all at once. What happened in the hospital room simply forced those hidden layers into the open. The signature on that document was not just a sudden act. It was the final piece of a pattern that had been forming for years. Each small moment from the past suddenly connected to the present, like pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. And as those connections become clearer, the understanding grows stronger that the betrayal experienced in that room was not an isolated decision, but part of a much deeper truth that had been waiting to be uncovered. As the shock of the hospital moment slowly settled, another layer of reality began to surface, one that had nothing to do with machines, medical charts, or the quiet routines of nurses moving through the hallway. Beneath the emotional weight of betrayal, there was also a growing awareness that decisions involving life, money, and authority rarely exist in isolation. They often leave trails, paperwork, signatures, financial movements, and legal responsibilities that cannot remain hidden forever. At first, those possibilities seemed distant. The mind had been so focused on processing the emotional pain that it hadn't yet considered the practical consequences of what had happened. But the more time passed, the clearer it became that the situation wasn't simply a private family matter. Hospitals operate within strict systems. Documents are recorded. Decisions about medical care often require formal authorization. Those records don't just disappear once a signature is placed on a form. That realization sparked a quiet curiosity. Questions began forming about what other documents might exist and what they might reveal. Medical orders are rarely the only paperwork connected to serious health situations. There are insurance records, financial authorizations, emergency contact forms, and sometimes even legal arrangements tied to medical decisions. Each one carries its own trail of responsibility and intention. As attention turned toward those possibilities, certain details started to stand out. Conversations that once seemed casual now felt more deliberate. The speed with which some decisions had been made appeared unusual. It began to feel as though there might have been more planning behind the scenes than anyone had admitted. The hospital staff had simply followed the instructions placed in front of them. But those instructions had to come from somewhere. The thought that other actions might exist, actions connected to finances, legal permissions, or personal gain, became impossible to ignore. When people make decisions based on greed or fear of financial loss, they often leave behind evidence without realizing it. Paper trails, digital records, and official forms have a way of preserving the truth long after the moment has passed. Slowly, the situation began to look less like a single shocking choice and more like the beginning of a larger revelation. The hospital room had exposed the emotional betrayal, but outside those walls there were systems and records capable of exposing something even deeper. And once the possibility of that hidden evidence entered the mind, the entire story began to shift toward a future where the truth might eventually become impossible for anyone to deny. Hospitals are not only places of medicine and recovery, they are also places governed by strict systems of documentation and ethical responsibility. Every important decision made within those walls must pass through layers of procedures designed to protect patients and ensure that medical staff follow clear guidelines. What might appear to be a simple piece of paperwork often carries a deeper significance within that system. Each form, each signature, and each entry in a patient's chart becomes part of an official record that can later reveal exactly how and why a decision was made. When the existence of the medical order became undeniable, attention naturally turned toward how such a decision could have moved through the hospital's processes. Medical staff cannot simply act on verbal instructions during critical situations. Hospitals require documentation, confirmation, and the proper authorization before a directive like that becomes active. This means the decision must pass through hands, desks, and electronic systems where it is reviewed, recorded, and acknowledged. That realization began to reveal something important. The quiet conversations among nurses and doctors earlier were not random or careless remarks. They were part of the hospital's ethical awareness. Medical professionals are trained to pay close attention when an order like that appears in a patient's file. It represents a moment where the usual instinct to fight for life must step aside because someone with authority has already determined a different course. Ethics committees, supervisors, and attending physicians often review these instructions to ensure that they meet legal and medical standards. While staff members may not question the legality of a signed document in the moment, they still recognize the seriousness of it. That awareness can be seen in subtle ways. The careful tone used when discussing the order, the extra attention given to verifying the paperwork, the quiet pauses that occur before acknowledging what the document requires them to do. Those procedures create a trail of accountability. The hospital system records when the order was submitted, who approved it, and how it became part of the patient's official chart. While the staff's role is to follow the directive once it is validated, the existence of those records means the story behind the decision does not remain hidden forever. Within those files and digital logs lies a silent witness to everything that occurred. Every step taken in processing the order becomes part of the hospital's memory, preserving details that may one day reveal the full truth behind a decision that once seemed to happen quietly and without question. At first glance, a do not resuscitate order appears to be nothing more than a medical instruction. In hospitals, it is often discussed in clinical terms, explained through policies and ethical guidelines that focus on patient autonomy and quality of life. Doctors and nurses are trained to treat it as a serious but sometimes necessary decision, especially in situations where continued medical intervention might only prolong suffering. On paper, it exists as a carefully worded directive meant to guide medical staff during the most critical moments. But outside the language of medicine, the meaning of such an order can take on a far more personal and symbolic weight. When someone learns that such a document exists in their own case, especially under circumstances that feel questionable, it stops being a neutral medical term. It begins to represent something much larger than the procedure it describes. In that moment, the phrase "do not resuscitate" starts to feel less like a guideline and more like a statement about value. The words quietly imply that if the worst happens, the usual fight to bring someone back will never even begin. No urgent rush of doctors, no frantic attempts to restart a fading heartbeat. Instead, there is acceptance of the outcome before it even occurs. For the person affected, that understanding can feel like a silent judgment. It suggests that somewhere along the way, someone decided that the effort to save that life was either unnecessary or not worth the consequences. Even if the decision was presented as practical or responsible, the emotional meaning behind it becomes impossible to separate from the act itself. The symbolism of the document grows heavier when it is connected to motives that have nothing to do with compassion or medical reality. When financial concerns or personal convenience appear to influence the decision, the order stops representing mercy and begins to look like abandonment. It becomes a quiet declaration that certain priorities outweighed the instinct to fight for survival. that symbolic meaning lingers long after the paperwork has been filed away. The phrase itself carries an echo of the moment when life was weighed against other factors and placed second, even within the sterile environment of a hospital, where decisions are often reduced to policies and protocols. The deeper meaning of those words can transform a simple document into a powerful reminder of how easily the value of a human life can be reduced to a line on a form. A medical crisis already places enormous strain on the human mind. The body may be weak, the future uncertain, and every moment feels suspended between hope and fear. In that fragile state, people naturally lean on the emotional support of those closest to them. Family becomes the anchor that keeps the mind steady while everything else feels unstable. But when that anchor suddenly feels unreliable, the psychological impact can be far deeper than the physical illness itself. The discovery of a decision like that introduces a type of emotional shock that is difficult to process. At first, the mind resists the reality because it conflicts with the deeply rooted belief that family exists to protect and defend. That belief is not something people consciously think about every day, it is something quietly woven into their sense of safety from childhood onward. When it is suddenly challenged, the mind struggles to reconcile the difference between expectation and reality. This inner conflict creates a powerful psychological tension. On one side is the memory of years spent believing in loyalty and care. On the other side is the evidence of a decision that appears to contradict those values. The brain tries to hold both ideas at once, searching for explanations that might reduce the emotional damage. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding. Perhaps the decision was made under pressure. Perhaps there was information that hasn't been fully explained. But as the truth becomes clearer, the psychological strain begins to deepen. The mind slowly accepts that the situation may not have been a mistake at all. That realization forces a person to question not just a single decision, but the entire foundation of trust that once existed. Trust, once broken in such a moment, does not simply return with time. It leaves behind a lasting sense of caution and emotional distance. Another psychological effect begins to appear as well: hyper-awareness. The mind becomes extremely alert to every detail, every conversation, every gesture from the people involved. Words that might once have seemed harmless are now examined carefully for hidden meaning. This heightened awareness becomes a form of protection, a way for the mind to prevent itself from being caught off guard again. In the midst of that mental turmoil, the person experiencing it undergoes a quiet transformation. The innocence of unquestioned trust begins to fade, replaced by a more guarded understanding of human motivations and the complicated ways people reveal their true priorities when faced with difficult choices. In the beginning, everything felt one-sided. The hospital room, the paperwork, the quiet confirmation from the medical staff, it all created the feeling that control over the situation had already been taken away. The decisions that mattered most had been made somewhere else, by someone else, long before there was any chance to respond. That sense of powerlessness is often the heaviest part of betrayal. It leaves a person feeling like their life has been reduced to something others can decide without question. For a while, that imbalance of power seemed absolute. Medical staff were bound by the instructions written in the file. The people who signed the documents appeared confident that their decision would simply remain in place without challenge. The entire system seemed to move forward as if the matter had already been settled. But moments like this often carry hidden turning points, points where the direction of control quietly begins to change. The shift didn't happen with a dramatic confrontation or a sudden announcement. Instead, it began through awareness. The realization that decisions leave traces started to grow stronger. Hospitals keep records, conversations happen among staff, and documents pass through systems designed to track every important action. What once felt like a sealed decision slowly started to look more like a trail of evidence waiting to be noticed. As that understanding deepened, the emotional balance began to move in a new direction. Instead of focusing only on the shock of what had been done, attention started turning toward the consequences of those choices. Every decision carries responsibility, especially when it involves life, legal authority, and medical care. What might have seemed like a simple solution in the moment could easily become something much more complicated once the full story began to surface. In that realization, the feeling of helplessness began to fade. The situation no longer looked like a closed chapter where one person's decision would remain unchallenged forever. Instead, it began to look like the opening act of something larger. The people who once seemed to hold all the control had unknowingly created circumstances where their own choices could eventually be examined, questioned, and understood by others. And in that quiet recognition, the balance of power slowly started to tilt in a different direction, setting the stage for a moment when the truth would begin to speak louder than the decision that once seemed final. The situation had already been heavy with emotional weight, but the moment when new pieces of information began to surface changed everything. Up until that point, the story had felt like something trapped inside the walls of the hospital room, confined to a few documents and quiet conversations among medical staff. But the truth rarely stays hidden when too many decisions, signatures, and financial concerns become tangled together. It started with small discoveries. Not dramatic revelations, but details that slowly appeared when people began looking more carefully at the circumstances surrounding the medical order. Hospitals maintain extensive records for every patient, forms, timestamps, approvals, and notes entered into electronic systems. What once seemed like a simple instruction in a chart started to reveal layers of information about when it was filed, how quickly it was processed, and who had authorized it. At the same time, conversations outside the hospital began to uncover other facts. Financial matters that had previously remained private suddenly became relevant to understanding the decision. Medical bills, insurance coverage, and discussions about expenses started to paint a clearer picture of the pressures that may have influenced what had happened. The possibility that money played a larger role than anyone admitted began to feel less like suspicion and more like an uncomfortable reality. As those pieces came together, the way people around the situation reacted began to shift. Staff members who had once simply followed the instructions in the file now showed a more careful interest in the story behind them. Questions started appearing in quiet conversations, and certain details began to circulate among those responsible for overseeing patient care. Even subtle changes in tone, longer pauses when reviewing documents, more attention given to verifying records, suggested that the situation had grown more complicated than it first appeared. For the person at the center of it all, the effect was profound. The decision that once felt like an unchangeable act of betrayal was now surrounded by evidence that could reveal the motivations behind it. Each new detail acted like a light shining on a part of the story that had previously remained in shadow. Slowly, the narrative began to change. What once looked like a quiet, private choice started to appear as something far more visible, something that others could now see and question in ways that were impossible when the truth was still hidden. For years, the image presented to the world had been carefully maintained. To outsiders, everything appeared stable and controlled, as though authority and respect naturally followed wherever that presence went. People tend to believe the version of someone they see most often, the confident voice in conversations, the decisive tone when discussing money or responsibility, the appearance of someone who always seems to know exactly what they are doing. Over time, that image becomes a kind of shield, protecting the person behind it from serious doubt or criticism. But images built on control and reputation can be fragile when the truth behind certain decisions begins to surface. What once looked like strength can quickly begin to resemble something else when people start examining the motivations that guided those choices. In this situation, the decision connected to the hospital document quietly became the crack that started spreading through that carefully constructed image. At first, nothing seemed different on the surface. Conversations still carried the same confident tone, explanations were delivered with calm certainty, and the assumption remained that the matter would simply fade away without further attention. But beneath that appearance, circumstances had already begun to shift. The growing trail of records, conversations, and questions slowly chipped away at the authority that once seemed unquestionable. As more details came into view, the perception others held began to change. The same people who once accepted every explanation without hesitation started looking more closely at the situation. Confidence in the narrative that had been presented began to weaken as inconsistencies appeared. Each unanswered question added pressure to the image that had been so carefully protected. What made the change even more significant was how quickly it happened once the truth started to gain attention. Reputation can take years to build, but it can begin to crumble in a matter of days when the foundation beneath it is revealed to be weaker than anyone expected. The authority that once felt solid suddenly seemed less convincing when people realized that a decision involving a human life may have been influenced by motives far removed from compassion. The result was a quiet but unmistakable collapse of that carefully maintained image. The certainty that once surrounded it began to dissolve, replaced by doubt, scrutiny, and the growing understanding that the person everyone thought they knew might not have been the person who truly existed behind the scenes. Surviving a moment of betrayal does something unusual to a person. At first, it feels like damage that can never truly heal. The emotional shock, the broken trust, and the realization that someone close made a choice that placed their own priorities above a life can feel overwhelming. In the beginning, the mind focuses almost entirely on the pain. Every memory, every thought circles back to the same question of why it happened and how someone could make such a decision. But time has a way of changing how that pain lives inside a person. What begins as something crushing slowly transforms into something else entirely. The emotional wound does not simply disappear, yet it starts to shape a deeper awareness about people, about loyalty, and about the difference between appearances and truth. That awareness becomes a kind of strength that didn't exist before the experience. In the quiet moments after the hospital crisis, when the mind begins to settle and the immediate shock fades, the realization emerges that surviving such betrayal requires a different kind of resilience. Physical recovery may take time, but emotional recovery demands something even more powerful: the ability to confront the truth without letting it destroy the sense of self. It means acknowledging what happened while refusing to let it define the future entirely. That process slowly builds a stronger sense of self-worth. The person who once depended on others for protection begins to understand that their value does not come from the approval or decisions of anyone else. The betrayal revealed something painful about those who made the decision, but it also revealed something important about the one who endured it. Surviving that moment proved an inner strength that had never been tested so severely before. With that strength comes clarity. The situation that once felt like a moment of helplessness begins to look different when viewed through the lens of survival. It becomes evidence that even when others failed to act with compassion, the person at the center of the story still remained standing. The experience transforms from a symbol of weakness into a symbol of endurance. And in that transformation lies a quiet form of empowerment, a realization that the attempt to diminish a life's value ultimately revealed a resilience that no one had expected to witness. For a while, it seemed as though the decision would remain untouched, quietly sitting in the background as just another medical instruction that no one would challenge. The people responsible for it appeared confident that the matter had already been settled. In their minds, the situation likely felt contained, as if the consequences of that choice would never reach beyond the walls of the hospital or the few documents filed away in medical records. But decisions that involve life, money, and authority rarely stay buried forever. Every action creates a ripple, even if it takes time before those ripples reach the surface. In this case, the consequences didn't arrive with a dramatic warning. They emerged gradually, building strength as more details began to connect with one another. It started when questions became harder to ignore. Once the situation drew attention, people naturally began looking deeper into the circumstances surrounding it. Records were reviewed more carefully. Conversations that once seemed routine were reconsidered with new understanding. Each piece of information added to a growing awareness that something about the decision didn't sit comfortably within the usual expectations of compassion and responsibility. Those small shifts began to create pressure where none had existed before. What had once been a private decision slowly became something others could examine and evaluate. The quiet confidence that the matter would disappear began to fade as more individuals became aware of what had happened and why. Consequences often appear in unexpected ways. They don't always arrive through dramatic confrontations or loud accusations. Sometimes they emerge through scrutiny, through the simple act of people asking questions and looking at facts. When those facts begin to form a clear picture, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. For the person who had once believed the decision would remain unquestioned, that growing attention became a turning point. The same authority that once allowed the choice to be made suddenly felt less certain under the weight of examination. Reputation, credibility, and trust, things that take years to build, can begin to weaken when others see evidence that contradicts the image someone tried to maintain. And as the reality of those consequences started to unfold, it became clear that the choice made in that quiet moment was no longer just a private act. It had set into motion events that would soon reach far beyond what anyone had originally expected. There is a quiet truth about human choices that many people ignore until it becomes impossible to avoid. Every decision carries consequences, even the ones made in silence, even the ones that seem clever or convenient in the moment. When someone acts out of selfishness or greed, it may appear for a short time as though they have escaped the weight of that decision. But life has a way of circling back, bringing those choices into the light when they are least expected. In the beginning, the person responsible for the decision may feel certain that they have protected their interests. Signing a document, calculating the financial implications, and convincing themselves that the action was practical or necessary can create a sense of control. To them, it might even feel like a solution, an efficient way to avoid complications, expenses, or responsibilities they would rather not face. But decisions based on greed often contain a hidden flaw. They are built on the assumption that no one will look closely enough to understand the true motive behind them. That assumption can hold for a while, especially when the decision is buried inside systems filled with paperwork and routine procedures. People trust those systems to function smoothly, rarely stopping to question the personal intentions that might have influenced a particular choice. Over time, though, the truth has a way of surfacing. Small details begin to connect. Conversations reveal pieces of the story, and records quietly preserve the evidence of what actually happened. What once looked like a practical decision slowly starts to resemble something else entirely when viewed through the lens of honesty. When that shift occurs, the original choice begins to carry a different meaning. Instead of appearing responsible or rational, it starts to look selfish. The attempt to protect money or avoid financial burden suddenly reveals itself as something far more damaging. Not only does it expose the lack of compassion behind the action, but it also begins to erode the trust and respect that once surrounded the person who made it. In that way, the consequences of greed rarely remain confined to the moment when the decision was made. They expand outward, touching reputation, relationships, and credibility. And when the full weight of that truth finally appears, it becomes clear that the attempt to save something through selfishness often ends up destroying far more than it ever protected. In the middle of pain and betrayal, the natural instinct is to imagine justice as something loud and immediate. People often picture confrontation, arguments, or dramatic moments where the truth is shouted into the open, and the person responsible is forced to face the consequences instantly. Anger creates that image because anger demands release. It wants the world to recognize the hurt and react to it right away. But real justice rarely follows that path. More often, it unfolds quietly and patiently, shaped by facts rather than emotions. The situation that began inside a hospital room slowly started to reveal this difference. At first, the pain created an overwhelming desire for answers and accountability, a feeling that someone needed to admit what had been done and explain why such a decision had been made. Yet as time passed, it became clear that shouting the truth would not necessarily make it stronger. Truth carries its own power when it is supported by evidence. Documents exist, records are preserved, conversations leave impressions in the minds of those who hear them. When those pieces come together naturally, they form a story that is far more convincing than any emotional accusation could ever be. Instead of being dismissed as anger or misunderstanding, the facts begin to speak for themselves. That realization changes the way justice is understood. Instead of chasing revenge fueled by emotion, attention shifts toward allowing the truth to reveal itself fully. Every record examined, every detail uncovered, and every question asked becomes part of a process that moves steadily toward clarity. It may not happen quickly, but its impact is often far more lasting. There is also a quiet strength in allowing the truth to stand on its own. When people see evidence and understand the full context of a decision, they reach their own conclusions without needing to be persuaded. Respect and credibility naturally follow the side where honesty and integrity remain intact. In this way, justice becomes something deeper than simple retaliation. It becomes the moment when reality is finally visible to everyone involved. The anger that once demanded immediate action fades into the background, replaced by the steady confidence that truth, when allowed to surface completely, has the ability to expose every hidden motive behind a choice. When everything finally settles and the emotional storm begins to fade, what remains is the lesson carved into memory by everything that happened. The hospital room, the quiet machines, the document with its heavy meaning, and the realization of why that decision had been made all become part of a larger understanding about human nature. Some experiences arrive in life not just as painful events but as revelations, moments that force a person to see the world with a clarity they never expected. At the center of that clarity is the understanding of how powerful greed can be when it begins to guide someone's choices. Money by itself is not evil, it is simply a tool people use to survive and build their lives. But when the fear of losing it becomes stronger than compassion, something important begins to change in the way a person thinks. Priorities shift quietly, almost invisibly at first. Practical decisions slowly start to replace moral ones, and what once felt unthinkable can suddenly appear reasonable through the narrow lens of financial calculation. In this situation, that shift revealed itself in the most painful way possible. A decision that should have been guided by care and responsibility instead appeared influenced by the desire to avoid cost and inconvenience. For the person who experienced the consequences of that decision, the lesson became impossible to ignore. Greed has a way of distorting judgment until people convince themselves they are protecting what matters most, when in reality they are risking far more. What makes that realization even more powerful is the way those choices eventually turn back on the person who made them. Actions taken in selfishness often create consequences that extend far beyond the original intention. A moment that seemed like a clever solution can become the beginning of a chain reaction that damages reputation, relationships, and trust. Looking back at everything that unfolded, the story becomes less about a single document or a single decision, and more about the deeper truth behind it. Greed does not simply harm the person it targets, it slowly erodes the life of the one who embraces it. And when the consequences finally arrive, they often take away the very things that person once believed they were protecting. In the end, the story was never just about a hospital room, a document, or a decision written in ink. It was about the moment when truth revealed what had been hidden beneath years of assumptions and trust. Life has a strange way of exposing people's real priorities when circumstances become difficult. When comfort, money, or reputation are placed on one side of the scale and a human life is placed on the other, the choices people make in that moment speak louder than anything they could ever say afterward. What began as a moment of betrayal slowly transformed into something much deeper. It became a lesson about strength, about survival, and about the quiet power of truth. Even when someone attempts to reduce a life to numbers or convenience, the value of that life cannot truly be erased. The experience may leave scars, but it also leaves clarity. It reveals who stood on the side of compassion and who allowed selfishness to guide their actions. In the end, the most powerful form of justice was not loud revenge or anger, it was the simple unfolding of reality. The truth surfaced piece by piece, allowing everyone to see the situation for what it truly was. And when the truth stands clearly in the light, it has a way of reshaping everything around it. Trust changes, reputations shift, and the real character of people becomes impossible to hide. But the most important part of the story is not the fall of someone else's choices. It is the survival and strength that came from enduring the moment itself. Walking away from such betrayal with a clearer understanding of self-worth is a kind of victory that cannot be taken away. It proves that a person's value is not determined by someone else's calculation, but by the resilience they carry within themselves. To everyone listening to this story, remember that life will sometimes place you in situations where people reveal their true priorities. When that happens, hold on to your integrity and your sense of worth. Those things are far more valuable than anything measured in money or convenience. Good luck to each of you on your own journey. May your lives be surrounded by people who choose compassion over selfishness, loyalty over calculation, and truth over silence. And from the bottom of my heart, thank you for taking the time to listen and share in this story. Your support and attention mean more than words can express.